Nobody likes to be thought of as a fool. But in early Buddhism, foolishness is more than simply a lack of intelligence. The Buddha used the term fool to describe people who, through their actions and words, deeds, created suffering for themselves and others. In this video, we'll discuss the early Buddhist concept of the fool, how it's connected to ignorance and attachment, and how we can overcome our own foolish tendencies in everyday life. First, what is a fool in early Buddhism? There are a number of words, at least two, that are generally translated that way. One is the term bala, which basically is translated as a fool or an idiot. The other is moga purisa, which basically means empty man or useless person, which is also sometimes translated as fool. Now, these do not specifically mean somebody who is unintelligent, but rather someone who lacks wisdom, and so who therefore acts in ways that are unskillful. This kind of unskillfulness is related to ignorance and to delusion. These are fundamental misunderstandings of what is the well-lived life and what is the path to freedom. Again, this is not simply a matter of book knowledge or of general intelligence, but rather a matter of personal integrity, of ethics, of kindness, of wisdom and how to live a proper life. There are several key sutta references that discuss this kind of topic, and the general way they put it is this: a fool is characterized by their deeds, and a wise or astute person is characterized also by their deeds. Now, when the Buddha uses the word deeds here, that is basically translating the word karma. That is, how we think, speak, and act intentionally, with intention. Again, being a fool is not about failing to pass tests, nor, again, about intelligence in general. It's about the purity of our intentions when we think, speak, and act. We might say that there are three key aspects to foolishness. The first of these is an ignorance of the way the world works, and of, we might say, the Four Noble Truths. That is to say, ignorance about the fact that all things are impermanent, that all things are in a state of change, that things arise due to causes and conditions and pass away due to causes and conditions, that there is no permanent, unchanging core to our being, that all things are to an extent unsatisfactory, and that suffering is brought about through craving and clinging, and ultimately through ignorance itself. The second aspect of foolishness involves unskillful action. As I've said, the fool acts in ways that are unskillful and therefore bring suffering to themselves and those around them. They tend to lack kindness, compassion, sympathetic joy, that is to say, the ability to take joy in the successes of others around them rather than getting jealous about them. And they lack equanimity. And third, the fool engages in attachment and egoism. That is, they get attached to their own views. They cling to them. They get attached to their own possessions, the things that surround them, the objects of their life. And they get attached to their own identity of who they think they really are. And as a result, these kinds of attachments bring suffering to themselves and indeed can easily bring suffering to those people around them. Now, there's one key upshot here, which I hope you will have gathered so far, which is that all of us, to the extent that we are not yet enlightened, are to some extent fools. This is an extremely important thing to keep in mind, which then allows us to turn to our second point, which is recognizing our own foolishness. The Dhammapada, perhaps the most famous book in early Buddhism, has a chapter entitled The Fool, which has some of the most important discussions of foolishness in the canon. In that chapter we read, "The fool who thinks they're a fool is wise at least to that extent, but the true fool is said to be one who imagines that they are wise." The biggest problem with fools, we might say, is that they lack the insight into their own lack of understanding. One example we can think of nowadays is what's known as the Dunning-Kruger effect, whereby people typically will overestimate their own abilities in fields in which they have limited or no competence. One example of this is brought forward by a survey done by the AAA, the American Automobile Association, where they say 3/4, that is 73% of U.S. drivers, consider themselves better than average drivers. Men in particular are confident in their driving skills, with 8 in 10 considering their driving skills better than average. And it should be clear that it is mathematically impossible for 80% of drivers to be above average. And this kind of conceit, which is what it is, it's a feeling that we're better than other people in regard to things we know nothing about, this kind of conceit carries over into many aspects of our daily life, where, for example, instead of relying on experts who spend their entire working careers studying something, instead we turn to some well-paid TV presenter to tell us about it, a TV entertainer, basically. One really key and upsetting and concerning example of this has to do with global warming. The key lesson here is that learning about our own ignorance is the first step, the key step, in gaining wisdom. Now, it's really not possible to change other people. Other people have to want to change in order to do that. However, we can work with ourselves. As again, this section of the Dhammapada talks about, it says, "Don't find faults with others, with what they've done or left undone. You should only watch yourself, what you've done or left undone." So we might ask ourselves, before engaging in discussions, do I have true competence in this particular field? Am I helping or hurting by engaging here? And if I'm not helping, perhaps it's best simply to step aside. And there are some signs we can look out for in order to not act the fool. For example, are we engaging, we might say mindlessly or thoughtlessly, out of anger or some kind of immediate response without considering it? Are we clinging to our views and refusing to accept other evidence that's brought forward in a reasonable fashion? Are we repeating harmful habits despite knowing that they're harmful, knowing better? So as I've already established, we are all to some extent fools. But how can we overcome that foolishness? Now I want to turn to 4 different methods we can use to help ourselves to overcome this foolishness that we all share. First of all, we can start to do so with good companionship. Again, the Buddha talks in the Dhammapada about this. He says, "If while wandering you find no partner equal or better than yourself, then firmly resolve to wander alone. There's no fellowship with fools." Now, this stanza here mirrors the advice we find in a different early Buddhist poem, the poem on the rhinoceros that I did a video about a while back. I'll leave a link to that down below, where the Buddha essentially, or whoever wrote this early poem, essentially argues that if we cannot find good companionship, then it's best simply to wander alone, in this case like a rhinoceros, like a lone rhinoceros. If, however, we are able to find good companionship, then we should treasure it. For many of us, associating with wise people is the first and most important step in reaching wisdom ourselves. In one early sutta, known as the Chanki Sutta, that again I did a video on, I'll leave a link to that one as well down in the notes if you want to hear more about that, the Buddha has a discussion with a young Brahmin. And in that discussion, they're trying to basically discover the ways that we can find truth, that we can lead ourselves to truth, that we might say, become wiser. And the Buddha goes through a long number of steps here, and I'm not going to go through them all, but one of them is to try to find an appropriate teacher, a teacher in whom we have a settled confidence, a well-grounded confidence, and then to follow their instructions. And what is it to find or to believe that we have this confidence or have this well-grounded confidence? It's to understand that the person we look to as a teacher really knows directly what they're talking about. In a related way, the Buddha also talks in a number of places about the importance of spiritual friends, or kalyana mittas. These are, again, friends among us who are perhaps wiser than we are, a little bit farther along the path, and who can help to direct us in the right direction. This is the role of Sangha in the Buddhist triple gem, the idea of Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. The role of Sangha is here, to direct us, to help us, to find and to preserve us, and to give us support while we're along the path. The second key step to overcoming our own foolishness is a sense of openness to criticism, willingness to learn. Once again, from the Dhammapada we read, "Regard one who sees your faults as a guide to a hidden treasure. Stay close to one so wise and astute who corrects you when you need it. Sticking close to such an impartial person, things get better, not worse." This kind of humility is so important in order to overcome our own foolishness. Now, there is, I think, a very key distinction to be made between destructive criticism and constructive criticism. But assuming that the person we're talking about criticizes us in a constructive way, gives us constructive feedback that helps us to grow rather than simply knocking us down, they are a true gem to us. They can be extremely helpful. Only a fool resists wise counsel. And yet many of us resist being corrected about anything. I know I myself have had that fault and have had to learn from it. So ask yourself if you resist these kinds of corrections or instead embrace them. It's not an easy kind of practice. The third way we can try to overcome our own foolishness is through mindfulness and wise reflection. In one early sutta, the Buddha is discussing just this kind of attitude with his son Rahula. And the Buddha says, "What do you think, Rahula? What is the purpose of a mirror?" Rahula answers, "It's for checking your reflection, sir." In the same way, deeds of body, speech, and mind should be done only after repeated checking. That is, the Buddha suggests we should reflect mindfully before committing acts of body, speech, or mind. Now, if that's not possible, if we don't have the time or foresight to do that, then at least we should reflect mindfully while we are engaged in these tasks. And if even that is too much for us, the Buddha says, then at least we should try to reflect mindfully after having done the actions. Were these things that we did beneficial or harmful? Did they bring happiness or suffering to ourselves and others? Of course, if they brought suffering, then we should consider not doing them again in the future. The fourth way we can strive to overcome our own foolishness is by working to let go of our own ego and attachment. Are we clinging to our views, to our status, to our identity? How are we doing this? Are we engaging in a kind of a conceit of thinking ourselves superior to others, or indeed inferior to others, this kind of comparing mind? For example, we might think, I'm better than the people around me because I've given up clinging to my own identity. Of course, once we engage in that kind of thought, we're right back into clinging to our own identity. So the wise among us will be people who are truly able to give up clinging to and identifying with status, identity, views, and such things. In conclusion, in early Buddhism, the fool is not somebody who is unintelligent or lacks book knowledge, but rather someone who is unwise and therefore acts in ways that are unskillful, harming themselves and other people. It follows that we are all, to some extent, fools to the extent that we are not yet enlightened. The route towards overcoming our own foolishness is through humility, the ability to learn from others, to learn from our mistakes, to learn from the world, to accept wise counsel, to be aware of our own limitations and imperfections, and be willing to grow. While foolishness is tied to ignorance, attachment, and ego, the wise person is one who is able mindfully to overcome these things, to give up attachments, to overcome their ordinary sense of egoism. So my question to you is, how have you tried to become wiser in your own life? Have you noticed your own foolishness at times and worked to correct yourself and learn from your mistakes, and how? I did an earlier video on the distinction between wisdom and knowledge, which is really what I've been discussing here all along, that there is a distinction between wisdom and, so we say, knowledge or book learning, and I'll leave a link to that video up here on the screen if you haven't seen it. If you're getting something out of these videos of mine, consider taking a look at my Patreon page, which is linked up here on the screen and down below in the notes, and see if you want to help support the channel and the work that I'm doing here. Thanks so much, and we'll catch you on the next video, and meanwhile, all of you, be well.